freedom. They said it would bring safety. They said it would bring hope. But in Ashland County, Georgia, just after the Civil War, freedom became something else entirely, something darker. Thomas Hayes had spent 34 years of his life as property, 34 years waking before dawn to work land he would never own, raising crops that filled the mouths of people who treated him like livestock. And yet, despite the endless labor, despite the constant oppression, Thomas had survived. He had survived by making himself valuable in a world that refused to see him as human. He had taught himself to read, studying a Bible he had secretly stolen from the plantation library, scratching letters into the dirt behind his cabin when no one could watch. Every word he learned was a small act of rebellion. Every letter carved into the soil was a quiet defiance. Then, one spring morning in 1865, everything changed. The war had ended. Word reached the Barlow plantation. Thomas stood in the cotton fields, the sun rising over acres of red Georgia clay, and he wept. He wept not for the years lost, but for the future he had yet to see. "You're free," said Gideon Watts, the overseer, his voice thick with barely contained rage. The word hung in the air like a curse. Freedom. For some it was a promise. For Thomas, it was the beginning of a new struggle. Most of the formerly enslaved people left the plantation, scattering like seeds on the wind. But Thomas stayed. Not because he loved Ashland County. Not because he felt a connection to the soil that had consumed his sweat. He stayed because his wife Ruth rested in an unmarked grave, hidden at the edge of the plantation cemetery. Thomas built a cabin with his own hands, using planks from a collapsed tobacco barn, and filling gaps with clay and moss. It was small, 12 by 10 feet, with a stone fireplace he built himself. Every night, as he stared into the flickering fire, he recorded births, deaths, and events in a ledger purchased with the first money he had ever earned as a free man. For 2 years life was hard, but hopeful. Refugees from nearby areas joined the community, fleeing places where hostility toward freed slaves had turned violent. The church congregation grew, and slowly the community found strength in numbers. Then it began. The disappearances. Benjamin Porter vanished first in October 1867. Esther Vaughn followed in March of 1868. James Holloway in May. Mary Tucker in July. Joseph King in September. Names Thomas wrote in his ledger became more than entries. They were warnings, cries for help that echoed in silence. Every disappearance happened at night. Every victim was alone. Every disappearance left the community trembling with fear. And yet, there was no one outside Ashland County who knew, no one who cared. The world moved on, oblivious to the vanishing of people who had only just gained their freedom. Thomas knew something dark was happening, something deliberate. And as he closed his ledger that night, staring into the darkness beyond his cabin, he realized that survival was no longer enough. He would have to fight, not just for himself but for the memory of the vanished, for the safety of his community, and for the truth that no one else would speak. Freedom, Thomas realized, was only the beginning. After the disappearances began, Thomas Hayes realized the fragile hope of Ashland County was slipping through his fingers. Names were vanishing from his ledger faster than he could write them. Benjamin Porter, Esther Vaughn, James Holloway, Mary Tucker, Joseph King. Each disappearance carved a silent wound into the community, and yet no one outside seemed to notice. No one seemed to care. Determined to find answers, Thomas met with his son Daniel and several trusted men from the community. They spoke in hushed tones under the cover of darkness, wary of the ever-present threat that someone might be listening. It was clear now. These were not random acts. Someone was deliberately targeting the freed people of Ashland County, and the danger was closer than they had imagined. The men began their investigation, carefully documenting the patterns. Each disappearance happened in the evening or at night. Each victim had been isolated. Each event left a void that the community could feel, though outsiders could not. The weight of fear settled over Ashland County like a thick fog. Thomas decided to take a more active role. He stayed awake nights, lantern in hand, watching over the community, alert to any movement in the shadows. They marked the trails, noting footprints, broken twigs, and any subtle clue that could reveal who or what was behind the vanishings. Week after week, Thomas recorded everything in meticulous detail. turning his ledger into a map of disappearance and danger. One October night, the effort finally bore fruit. The men discovered footprints leading from the outskirts of the town into the dense woods. They followed them cautiously, hearts pounding, until they found evidence of a hidden shelter, an abandoned cabin, but with signs of recent occupation. Food scraps, a small fire pit, a crude bed. Thomas recognized the marks of human suffering, the evidence that someone had been held here, someone had suffered. The discovery confirmed their worst fears. These disappearances were deliberate. Someone powerful, someone determined, was exploiting the newly freed for profit, continuing the horrors of slavery under the cover of darkness. Word of the investigation spread through the community, uniting them in quiet determination. Families began traveling in groups, sharing information, and setting watch schedules. Though fear remained, courage began to take root. Thomas's role as record keeper evolved. He was no longer just documenting events, he was guiding his people, preserving knowledge that might one day protect them all. But danger was never far. Shadows lurked in the night, and Thomas understood that a single misstep could cost lives. Every step, every decision carried weight. The community had to be vigilant, not just for survival, but to uncover the truth that the world outside refused to see. As Thomas closed his ledger at the end of another long night, he reflected on the stakes. The vanished were more than names. They were a warning, a call to action. And he knew that in a town where silence had become a weapon, only those willing to bear witness could fight back. Freedom had brought them out of bondage, but in Ashland County, it had also brought a new, terrifying uncertainty. And Thomas Hayes was determined that no one, not even death itself, would erase the lives of the missing. Thomas Hayes had grown accustomed to the nights of fear in Ashland County, but nothing could have prepared him for what came next. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Thomas returned to his small cabin, weary from another night of vigilance. Smoke, flames, the smell of burning wood filled the air. His cabin, his safe place, the home he had built with his own hands, was being destroyed. He barely escaped with his life, clutching his ledger, the fragile record of births, deaths, and disappearances that he had been keeping for years. Behind him, the fire consumed the walls, the roof collapsing with a deafening roar. It was a message, a warning to silence him, to stop the truth from spreading. But Thomas refused to be broken. He fled into the darkness, finding refuge among trusted neighbors. Word of the attack spread quickly, and the community rallied. Families who had been fearful now stood together. Their grief transformed into determination. They would not be intimidated. They would not let the vanished be forgotten. Thomas continued his work, documenting every disappearance, every clue, and now every threat. The community devised safety protocols. They traveled in groups, always alert. They shared information about suspicious activities. Every member became a watcher, a protector, a guardian of the truth. It was during this time that the investigation began to reveal something horrifying. Thomas and his allies discovered that a group of wealthy white men in Ashland County were responsible for the abductions. They were capturing freed slaves, forcing them into labor, continuing the practices of slavery under a new guise. The fear that had haunted the community for years was no accident. It was calculated. Despite the danger, Thomas's courage inspired action. Other communities, hearing of Ashland County's plight, began to come forward, sharing their own stories of exploitation and disappearance. Slowly, the truth began to emerge from the shadows. The vanishing stopped, but the scars remained. Thomas understood that freedom alone was not enough. Vigilance, courage, and community were essential. Each entry in his ledger was more than a record. It was a testament, a promise that no one would forget the missing. Through determination and unity, the community began to reclaim their lives. The perpetrators were eventually exposed, held accountable for their crimes. Justice was served, not swiftly, but surely. And in the wake of fear, hope began to bloom once again. Thomas Hayes, who had once been property himself, had become the protector of memory, the voice of the silenced, the keeper of truth. His courage ensured that Ashland County would never forget its missing, and that the stories of injustice and resilience would be carried forward for generations to come. Freedom had brought them out of bondage, But it was their courage that ensured survival, their unity that preserved memory, and Thomas's unwavering commitment that turned tragedy into a legacy. After the cabin attack, the people of Ashland County understood one thing clearly. Survival alone would no longer be enough. Freedom had not protected them from danger, and the threats lurking in the shadows were very real. The community realized that if they wanted to endure and protect each other, they needed a plan. Thomas Hayes, clutching his ledger, became not just a chronicler, but a leader. Together with his son Daniel and other trusted members, he organized a network of watchers. Families traveled in groups. Every evening, pairs or trios would patrol the outskirts, lanterns casting long shadows through the red clay fields. Footpaths were memorized. Every unfamiliar sound was noted. Communication became a lifeline. Secret signals, whispered messages, and trusted informants scattered across neighboring communities. The disappearances had stopped temporarily, but fear still clung to the air. Each person knew the wealthy men behind the abductions were powerful, influential, and ruthless. Yet, Thomas refused to let fear paralyze him. Every entry in his ledger was more than documentation. It was evidence, a silent accusation that one day could expose the truth. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, Thomas and his allies began connecting the dots. Patterns emerged, names and locations linked to the shadowy figures orchestrating the abductions. Every observation, every small piece of information, strengthened their case. The network of watchers reported suspicious movements. Communities began sharing tips, combining their knowledge. It became clear that the perpetrators could not hide forever. Then the moment of reckoning approached. Thomas and the community, armed with evidence and testimonies, confronted the reality. These men were not just bullies or opportunists. They were organized, exploiting newly freed African Americans to maintain wealth and power. Their crimes were deliberate, systematic, and cruel. But the community had grown stronger. They had learned to move together, to watch each other's backs, and to document every detail. They presented their findings to the few officials willing to listen, to allies who had begun to recognize the scale of the injustice. The wheels of justice began turning, slowly but inexorably. Even in the face of potential retaliation, Thomas continued his nightly vigils, ledger in hand. Every disappearance he had recorded, every story he had preserved, became a weapon against the silence that had allowed these crimes to continue. Ashland County had transformed from a place of fear into a community of resilience. By now, the residents understood the lesson Thomas had been teaching them all along. Freedom was not a single moment. It was a continuous effort, a responsibility, and a commitment to protecting one another. And while the perpetrators may have thought they could act in the shadows, the truth was emerging, piece by piece, through courage, unity, and meticulous documentation. The stage was set for justice. The network was strong. The ledger held the truth. And Thomas Hayes, once a man defined by slavery, was now the guardian of freedom, memory, and justice for Ashland County. The long shadow over Ashland County was finally lifting. Months of careful observation, documentation, and courage had brought the community to a turning point. Thomas Hayes's ledger, once a quiet record of grief and fear, had become the key to exposing the truth. Every name, every disappearance, every detail had been preserved. And now, the perpetrators could no longer hide. The wealthy men who had orchestrated the abductions were brought into the light. Their network of exploitation, once hidden in darkness, was revealed piece by piece. The world outside Ashland County began to take notice, as Thomas and his allies presented evidence, testimony, and witness accounts. Justice, delayed but relentless, was finally within reach. The community watched with cautious hope as the men who had terrorized them faced consequences. It was not immediate and it was not easy, but the tide had turned. Families who had lived in fear began to rebuild. The nights were no longer ruled by shadows of uncertainty. They walked the red clay fields with their heads held high, their unity stronger than any threat. Thomas Hayes did not stop recording. His ledger continued to grow, documenting not only the horrors of the past but the courage and resilience that had emerged in response. Each entry became a testament, not just to the vanished, but to the living, to the children who would grow up knowing that their ancestors had fought, endured, and survived. The story of Ashland County became more than a tale of fear. It became a lesson. Silence, once a weapon used to oppress, was now shattered by the courage of those willing to bear witness. Thomas's dedication ensured that no one would forget the names of the missing, the struggles endured, or the triumph of community over cruelty. The legacy of Thomas Hayes endured in every act of vigilance, every hand extended in protection, and every voice raised against injustice. The people of Ashland County learned that freedom was not merely the absence of chains. It was the ongoing effort to protect each other, to fight for justice, and to honor the memory of those who had suffered. As Thomas stood in the early morning light, looking over the fields he had once toiled on as a slave, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The ledger was heavy in his hands, but it was a weight he carried willingly, because within its pages lay the truth, the courage, and the resilience of a community that had refused to be erased. Freedom had brought them out of bondage, but it was courage, unity, and the unyielding commitment to truth that had preserved their lives, their stories, and their dignity. And though the shadows of the past would always remain, Ashland County had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever the future might hold. Thomas Hayes had ensured one undeniable truth: the vanished would not be forgotten, and the story of their survival, and the fight for justice, would echo for generations to come. With the perpetrators exposed and justice finally served, Ashland County began to breathe again. The nights of fear and uncertainty slowly gave way to days filled with cautious hope. Families rebuilt their homes. Children ran through the red clay fields once haunted by shadows, laughter piercing the silence that had ruled for so long. Thomas Hayes, once a man bound by chains and oppression, had become a pillar of resilience and memory. His ledger, heavy with names, dates, and events, was no longer just a record. It was a legacy, a story for the living and a memorial for the lost. Every page spoke of courage, resistance, and the unyielding human spirit that had refused to bow to injustice. The community, inspired by Thomas's determination, began teaching their children the lessons of vigilance and unity. They spoke openly about the horrors they had endured, ensuring that no one would ever forget the cost of freedom and the price of silence. They planted seeds of knowledge alongside crops in the fields, cultivating both life and awareness. Even outsiders, once indifferent to the plight of Ashland County, began to take notice. Neighboring communities, hearing the stories, adopted similar safety networks and record-keeping practices. Thomas's meticulous documentation became a blueprint for others who sought to protect the newly freed from the shadows of exploitation. Despite the pain of the past, the people of Ashland County found strength in their collective experience. The memory of those who had disappeared was honored through community gatherings, church ceremonies, and storytelling. Each account reinforced the values of courage, vigilance, and justice. Thomas Hayes had taught them that freedom was not a single moment, but an ongoing responsibility, a continuous effort to protect each other and preserve the truth. The red clay fields, once a symbol of labor and oppression, now stood as a testament to resilience. Every sunrise over Ashland County reminded the people that survival alone was not enough. They had to thrive, remember, and build a future rooted in justice and solidarity. Thomas continued his nightly walks, lantern in hand, not out of fear, but out of duty. He checked on families, ensured the safety networks remained intact, and added new pages to his ledger. His work became a symbol of the power of memory and the strength of community, proving that one person's courage could inspire an entire town. The story of Ashland County, preserved in ink and in heart, began to spread. Letters and reports reached distant towns. The courage of Thomas Hayes and his community became a beacon, showing the world that even in the face of cruelty and silence, truth, unity, and resilience could prevail. And as the sun set each evening, casting long shadows over the fields, Thomas Hayes would look toward the horizon with quiet satisfaction. The vanished were remembered, justice had been pursued, and the legacy of freedom, though hard won, was alive in every child, every family, and every story shared under the open sky. Years passed in Ashland County, but the lessons of the past remained alive. The community that had once trembled in fear now flourished with courage and purpose. Thomas Hayes, the man who had endured decades of bondage, had become more than a survivor. He was a symbol, a guardian, and a teacher. His ledger, filled with the names of the vanished and the chronicles of their lives, had grown into a testament to resilience. Families kept copies, ensuring that future generations would understand the sacrifices, struggles, and victories of those who came before them. Thomas's meticulous documentation had preserved not just history, but the moral compass of a community. The town began to expand, welcoming families from nearby areas who sought refuge from hostility and oppression. Churches, schools, and small businesses emerged, all infused with the spirit of unity and vigilance that Thomas had instilled. The community thrived not because danger had vanished entirely, but because its people had learned to protect, support, and uplift one another. Thomas Hayes's influence stretched beyond Ashland County. Other towns heard the stories of courage and determination. Leaders and families alike adopted similar practices, keeping records, establishing watch systems, and fostering a culture of shared responsibility. The legacy of one man had sparked a movement that transcended the boundaries of a single town. Yet, Thomas never sought recognition. His reward was the safety, dignity, and hope of the people around him. Every child who learned to read, every family that found security, every story remembered. These were the victories he cherished. And each evening, as he walked the familiar paths of Ashland County, lantern in hand, he felt the weight of responsibility balanced by the warmth of accomplishment. The vanished were no longer forgotten. Their names echoed in church services, in lessons to children, and in conversations across neighboring towns. The fear that had once gripped Ashland County had been replaced with vigilance and empowerment. Silence was no longer a weapon. It was a memory, a cautionary tale, and a call to action. In the end, Thomas Hayes taught a simple but profound truth. Freedom alone is not enough. It must be defended, nurtured, and preserved through courage, knowledge, and unity. One person's commitment can ripple through generations, transforming lives, communities, and history itself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the red clay fields, Thomas Hayes stood tall. The ledger in his hands was no longer just a record of the past, it was a guide for the future. The town he had helped shape was alive with hope, resilience, and the unbreakable spirit of its people. Ashland County had endured the darkness, and now, under the guidance of Thomas Hayes, it was a beacon of courage, memory, and justice, a living legacy for generations to come. The story of Ashland County did not end with justice for the perpetrators. It began to travel far beyond the red clay fields, and the cabins Thomas Hayes had once called home. Letters, testimonies, and accounts of courage were shared with neighboring towns, spreading the lessons of vigilance, unity, and unyielding resolve. Thomas Hayes had become more than a local hero. He was a symbol of what one person could achieve when armed with truth and courage. Communities that had suffered in silence found inspiration in Ashland County. They adopted similar practices, recording names, documenting disappearances, and watching over each other. Across the state, and eventually in other regions, the ripples of Thomas's work created a network of resilience that defied oppression. The vanishing of the formerly enslaved had once seemed like a story no one would hear. But thanks to Thomas, it became a warning, a lesson, and a call to action. Justice, delayed but relentless, had proven that courage and meticulous effort could overcome even the most entrenched systems of exploitation. Families in Ashland County flourished. Children learned to read and write, carrying forward the knowledge Thomas had risked his life to preserve. Churches and schools became hubs not just for learning, but for storytelling, sharing accounts of fear, resilience, and triumph. The ledger that had survived the flames of Thomas's cabin became a sacred document, a record of suffering, endurance, and hope. Even as decades passed, Thomas Hayes's influence remained. People who had once been too afraid to speak found their voices. Communities recognized that freedom was not simply the absence of chains. It was an ongoing responsibility to protect each other and preserve memory. The lessons of Ashland County spread like seeds, taking root in the hearts of people far beyond its borders. And yet, for Thomas, the reward was quiet. He never sought fame or recognition. His satisfaction came from knowing that the vanished were remembered, that the children and families of his community were safe, and that the principles of justice, vigilance, and courage had been cemented for future generations. As the sun rose over the fields of Ashland County, casting light on the places where shadows once ruled. Thomas Hayes reflected on the journey. From the depths of slavery to the heart of leadership, from despair to hope, his life had become a testament to the unbreakable human spirit. Every ledger entry, every community meeting, every watchful night had contributed to a legacy that would endure far longer than any individual life. Ashland County's story had become more than a local legend. It had become a blueprint for resilience and justice, a guide for communities everywhere facing oppression and silence. And Thomas Hayes, the man who had once been property, stood as a reminder to the world. Courage, truth, and unwavering commitment can illuminate even the darkest corners of history. Decades had passed since Thomas Hayes first stood in the cotton fields of Ashland County, a man who had endured decades of slavery. Yet the lessons of those years and the courage he had shown remained alive in every corner of the community he had helped rebuild. The ledger, once a simple record of names and dates, had become a symbol, a reminder of the vanished, the survivors, and the power of memory. Thomas often walked through the town, now filled with children's laughter and bustling markets. The fear that had once clung to the red clay fields had faded, replaced by hope and determination. Every face he passed carried the legacy of resilience. Every story shared reinforced the truth. Silence could no longer be a weapon. He reflected on the journey, the years of danger, the nights spent guarding his people, and the relentless effort to document the truth. Freedom had been just the first step. The real challenge lay in ensuring that freedom was protected, that the lessons of injustice were never forgotten, and that courage could be passed from one generation to the next. Thomas's story was more than a local tale. It was a universal lesson. Across the country, and even beyond, communities learned that one person's courage could ignite a movement. That vigilance, unity, and truth were stronger than oppression. That memory, preserved with care and courage, could shield the living and honor the lost. He often thought of the vanished, the friends, neighbors, and family members who had disappeared in the dark of night. Their names lived on in the ledger, their stories shared in homes, churches, and schools. Thomas knew that remembrance was the ultimate act of defiance against injustice. To forget would have been to surrender. To remember was to fight, even decades later. In every sunrise over Ashland County, Thomas saw both the scars and the triumphs. The land that had once borne witness to suffering now flourished with life and learning. And though the shadows of the past could never be erased completely, they no longer dictated the future. The courage of a few had transformed the lives of many. Thomas Hayes's legacy was clear. Freedom alone was not enough. Justice must be pursued, memory must be preserved, and communities must stand together against oppression. And when those principles are upheld, even the darkest moments can become a source of light for generations to come. As he closed his ledger one last time, Thomas looked across the fields he had once labored on, the graves of the vanished in the distance, and the thriving community surrounding him. The story of Ashland County was complete, not just as a chronicle of suffering, but as a testament to resilience, courage, and the enduring power of truth. In the end, Thomas Hayes had shown the world that one person, armed with courage and conviction, could transform fear into hope, silence into a story, and oppression into a lasting legacy. The red clay of Ashland County had witnessed pain, courage, loss, and triumph. For decades, shadows had moved unseen across its fields, carrying fear and silence. But now, those same fields were alive with the legacy of resilience. Every face, every home, every story told under the open sky bore the mark of a community that had refused to be broken. Thomas Hayes, once a man defined by chains, had become the heartbeat of that transformation. His ledger, the chronicle of vanished lives and unwavering courage, had become a symbol, a reminder to all who came after that memory is power, and truth is unbreakable. Even as he walked alone through the quiet fields at dawn, the echoes of the past whispered in the wind. The vanished were remembered. Their lives, their stories, their courage, they were never lost. But the story did not end there. Ashland County had become more than a town. It had become a lesson to the world. That vigilance, unity, and courage can protect the living, honor the dead, and confront injustice wherever it hides. Communities far beyond its borders looked to Ashland County as a beacon, learning that one person's determination could ignite change for generations. Thomas paused at the edge of the cemetery where Ruth, his beloved wife, was buried in the unmarked grave he had once visited in sorrow. He placed a small hand-carved marker by her side, not just for her, but for all who had been silenced. He whispered their names, one by one, a final tribute to those who had disappeared, and a vow that their memory would never fade. As the sun rose, painting the fields in gold, Thomas looked out across the town he had helped shape. Children's laughter carried on the wind. Families tended their crops, rebuilt homes, and shared meals together. Shadows that once haunted every corner had been replaced by light, by life, hope, and determination. Yet the ledger remained open, because Thomas knew that vigilance is not a moment, it is a lifetime. Freedom, justice, and courage must always be renewed. He had fought for the past, guided the present, and left a blueprint for the future. The story of Ashland County, the vanished, and the brave who stood against oppression would live on forever. And so, as Thomas Hayes turned to leave the fields, lantern now unlit, he carried with him more than a record. He carried the unbroken spirit of a people, the lessons of history, and the enduring truth that even in the darkest nights, courage can ignite a light that will shine for generations. Ashland County had survived. It had endured. And through the courage of Thomas Hayes and his community, it had become immortal, a story of freedom, resilience, and hope that would never be silenced.